Who let the maintenance guy into the boardroom? 10 minutes later, nobody could look him in the eye. The laughter started before Daniel Carter even reached the conference table. It was not loud. It did not need to be. In rooms filled with power, people rarely shouted their opinions. They delivered them through smiles, glances, and the confidence that came from believing they already knew who mattered. Daniel felt those glances the moment the elevator doors opened on the 47th floor. The headquarters of Hayes Global Industries occupied nearly the entire upper section of a glass tower overlooking downtown Chicago. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed miles of skyline. Polished marble reflected the morning sunlight. Executives moved through the hallways carrying tablets, reports, and schedules worth millions of dollars. Daniel carried a toolbox. That difference seemed to be all anyone noticed. He walked calmly toward the boardroom entrance. His dark maintenance uniform looked plain among the expensive suits surrounding him. A company identification badge hung from his pocket. His work boots made quiet sounds against the polished floor. Several executives waiting outside the boardroom glanced toward him. One raised an eyebrow. Another smirked. A third leaned toward a colleague and whispered something that triggered a round of quiet laughter. Daniel pretended not to notice. Years of being a single father had taught him a valuable lesson. People often revealed more about themselves than about you when they rushed to judge. Inside the boardroom, preparations for the company's most important meeting of the year were underway. The long conference table stretched nearly 30 feet from end to end. Large display screens covered one wall. Financial reports sat neatly arranged at every seat. Senior leadership teams from multiple divisions had gathered to review a proposed acquisition worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The atmosphere felt tense, focused, important. Daniel stepped inside and headed toward the projection system mounted near the rear of the room. A scheduling issue had caused technical problems during the previous evening's setup. He had been assigned to perform a final inspection before the presentation began. To him, it was simply another work order. To everyone else, his presence seemed out of place. "Excuse me," one executive said while looking at Daniel's toolbox. "The service entrance is downstairs." Several people chuckled. Daniel smiled politely. "I am here to check the presentation system." The executive nodded as if that confirmed every assumption he already had. "Of course you are." Daniel continued working. He opened a maintenance panel and began reviewing connections. Nearby conversations continued. Most ignored him completely. Others did not bother lowering their voices. "Can you imagine spending your career fixing cables?" one man said. Another laughed. "At least it is less stressful than this meeting." Daniel focused on the equipment. The projector powered on successfully. Signal pathways checked out. Audio systems responded normally. Everything appeared routine. Yet as he connected diagnostic software to the presentation network, something unusual caught his attention. A file appeared briefly on the display system before disappearing. Just a fraction of a second. Most people would have missed it entirely. Daniel did not. He frowned slightly, then continued working. At precisely 9 o'clock, the boardroom doors opened again. Every conversation stopped immediately. Victoria Hayes entered. As chief executive officer, she carried the kind of authority that changed the atmosphere simply by walking into a room. Her navy business suit looked flawless. Her posture radiated confidence. Executives straightened in their seats. Conversations ended mid-sentence. Victoria greeted several board members before reviewing the meeting agenda. Then her eyes landed on Daniel. The maintenance uniform, the toolbox, the open equipment panel. For a brief moment, her expression tightened, not with anger, with impatience, the kind born from managing a company where every minute mattered. Daniel noticed, but said nothing. He returned his attention to the screen. Yet something continued bothering him. The file he had glimpsed moments earlier. The numbers attached to it. The folder structure. None of it seemed consistent with the acquisition reports currently displayed across the boardroom screens. It was a tiny detail, almost invisible, easy to ignore. But Daniel had built his entire life around paying attention to small details. Because small details often carried the biggest consequences. Across the room, executives settled into their seats. Victoria reviewed opening remarks. Board members prepared documents. Coffee cups rested beside financial reports. Outside the windows, the city stretched endlessly beneath a bright morning sky. Everything appeared perfectly normal. Everything appeared completely under control. Yet standing quietly near the projection system, Daniel Carter found himself staring at a discrepancy nobody else had noticed. And within the next few minutes, that tiny detail would place a maintenance worker directly in the center of a boardroom conversation nobody expected him to join. Victoria Hayes began the meeting with the confidence of someone accustomed to making decisions that shaped entire industries. Her voice carried clearly through the boardroom. Charts appeared on the massive screens. Financial projections filled the displays. Senior executives nodded along as she outlined the acquisition strategy that had consumed months of planning. Around the table sat some of the most influential people in the company: division presidents, financial officers, legal advisors, board members. Every seat represented authority. Every opinion carried weight. At the very back of the room stood Daniel Carter beside the projection system. To everyone else, he was invisible. To Daniel, however, the numbers on the screen were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. He had seen the same project file name appear briefly during his diagnostic check. Now portions of those figures were being presented publicly. The problem was simple. They did not match. Not completely. The discrepancy was small enough to escape casual notice, yet large enough to create serious consequences if the acquisition moved forward. Daniel watched carefully. One slide replaced another. Revenue forecasts, asset valuations, risk assessments. The presentation looked flawless. Almost too flawless. He felt a familiar sensation settling in the back of his mind. The same feeling he had experienced years earlier when reviewing financial models during a completely different life. Back when his days involved spreadsheets instead of maintenance requests. Back before becoming a single father changed everything. Victoria continued speaking. Based on current projections, the acquisition is expected to generate substantial growth within the first 18 months. Several board members nodded. One executive smiled confidently. Another wrote notes beside the printed reports. No one questioned the conclusion. Daniel looked toward the screen again. The numbers still bothered him. More specifically, one assumption hidden inside the forecast calculations. It appeared reasonable at first glance. Yet when combined with another figure buried deeper within the presentation, the entire model became unstable. Most people would never notice. They were reviewing conclusions. Daniel was reviewing logic. The distinction mattered. The meeting moved forward. Discussion shifted toward implementation plans, timelines, staffing adjustments, regional expansion strategies. The atmosphere grew increasingly optimistic. Confidence spread around the table. Then Daniel noticed something else. A supporting document attached to the presentation. For less than a second, it appeared in a preview window when an executive switched slides. Again, most people missed it. Daniel did not. The document contained a data reference date. The date was wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Just enough to change everything. He frowned slightly. The room remained focused on celebrating a future success that might not actually exist. Finally, Daniel stepped forward. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Simply enough to be heard. "Excuse me." The room paused. Heads turned. Conversation stopped. Victoria looked toward him with visible impatience. One board member blinked in surprise. Another appeared annoyed by the interruption. Daniel spoke calmly. "I think there may be an issue with one of the projections." Silence followed. Then several executives exchanged amused glances. One of them actually laughed. "An issue?" Another smiled. "With the acquisition model?" The tone carried the unmistakable message. "Who does he think he is?" Victoria folded her arms. "Mr. Carter, correct?" Daniel nodded. "Yes. You are here for the presentation equipment." "That is correct." A few smiles appeared around the table. Victoria continued. "Then perhaps we should allow the finance team to focus on financial analysis." More laughter followed. Daniel remained calm. The response did not surprise him. It rarely surprised him when people confused job titles with intelligence. He glanced toward the screen, then back toward Victoria. "I understand." His voice remained respectful. "I only thought you would want to know that one of the underlying assumptions appears inconsistent with the supporting data." The room became quiet again. Not because anyone believed him. Because they were amazed he continued speaking. Victoria looked toward the chief financial officer. The executive smiled dismissively. "Our team reviewed every projection extensively." Several board members nodded in agreement. Victoria returned her attention to Daniel. "Thank you for your concern." The words sounded polite. The tone did not. Daniel understood the difference. Around the table, Confidence returned immediately. Discussions resumed. Yet as Daniel stepped back toward the projection system, he noticed something important. One board member had stopped smiling. An older director near the far end of the table quietly reopened his report and looked again at one specific page. Just one page. Just one detail. And for the first time since the meeting began, someone else in the room had started paying attention. The older director's name was Richard Monroe. He had spent nearly 4 decades reviewing corporate transactions, and one habit had never left him. When something felt wrong, he looked twice. While the rest of the boardroom returned its attention to the presentation, Richard quietly flipped back through the financial packet resting in front of him. The room continued moving forward. Victoria Hayes discussed projected market expansion. Executives presented growth forecasts. Charts filled the screens. Yet Richard's attention remained fixed on a single table buried deep within the supporting documentation. Daniel Carter noticed it immediately. The older man had stopped taking notes. That was unusual. More importantly, he was comparing figures from 2 different sections of the report. Daniel remained beside the projection system and said nothing. He had already made his observation. The decision belonged to them. Outside the windows, sunlight reflected from neighboring skyscrapers. Inside, the boardroom maintained its polished appearance of certainty. But certainty and accuracy were not always the same thing. As the presentation advanced, Daniel's mind drifted briefly to another chapter of his life. Years earlier, before becoming a maintenance technician, he had spent long nights analyzing financial models for investment firms. Numbers had once been his entire career. Then life changed. His wife passed away unexpectedly when Lily was still very young. Suddenly titles stopped mattering. Prestige stopped mattering. The only thing that mattered was being present for his daughter. He left the corporate world behind. The decision cost him financially. It also gave him something priceless. Time. Stability. Purpose. Few people knew that story. Most people saw a maintenance uniform and assumed they understood everything. Daniel rarely corrected them. Meanwhile, at the conference table, a senior vice president concluded his portion of the presentation. Based on our analysis, the downside risk remains minimal. Several board members nodded. Victoria looked satisfied. The chief financial officer smiled confidently. Richard Monroe did not smile. He raised a hand. The room quieted. Victoria turned toward him. Richard, the veteran director, adjusted his glasses. I would like clarification regarding a source assumption used in Section 7. The chief financial officer glanced down at his report. Of course. Richard pointed toward a page. The market exposure calculation appears to use a reference period ending 6 months ago. The executive nodded. That is correct. Richard frowned slightly. Why? A brief silence followed. Not alarming. Just unexpected. The executive cleared his throat. That was the latest consolidated data available during model development. Richard slowly turned another page. Then why are revenue assumptions based on current quarter projections? A few heads lifted around the table. Victoria's expression tightened slightly. The executive responded carefully. We adjusted certain inputs to reflect updated performance. Richard nodded. Only certain inputs. More silence. Daniel watched quietly. The questions were simple. The answers were becoming complicated. The chief financial officer began explaining methodology. Technical language filled the room. Most attendees appeared satisfied. Richard did not. He continued reviewing the documents. Then he looked toward the screen displaying projected returns. Would someone explain how the risk model changes if both data sets use the same reporting period? The room became noticeably quieter. Another executive shifted in his seat. Victoria glanced toward the finance team. For the first time all morning, uncertainty entered the room. Small, barely visible, but present. Daniel recognized it immediately. Because the answer was obvious. The model changed dramatically. That was the problem. Richard continued. Has anyone run that version? No immediate response came. Several executives exchanged looks. Victoria folded her arms. I assume we have. The chief financial officer hesitated. Only for a second. Yet in a room filled with experienced leaders, 1 second felt very long. Daniel looked down at the floor. He understood exactly what was happening. The discrepancy he noticed was beginning to surface naturally. Not because he forced the issue. Because facts have a habit of finding daylight. Richard slowly closed the report. I would like to see that analysis before we proceed with approval. The atmosphere changed instantly. Optimism faded. Confidence softened. Discussions that had felt routine now felt important. Victoria glanced briefly toward the back of the room where Daniel stood beside the projection system. Their eyes met for less than a moment. Then she looked away. The meeting continued. Yet the rhythm was different now. Questions appeared. Additional documents were requested. Assumptions faced scrutiny. And for the first time since Daniel entered the boardroom, several executives stopped viewing him as part of the furniture. Because an uncomfortable possibility was beginning to emerge. The maintenance worker they laughed at might have noticed something the experts missed. The room no longer felt comfortable. That was the first thing Victoria Hayes noticed. 30 minutes earlier, the acquisition presentation had carried the smooth confidence of a deal already approved. Now every page seemed heavier. Every number demanded another look. Every assumption invited another question. Richard Monroe sat quietly reviewing documents while several executives searched through supporting reports on their tablets. The atmosphere had shifted from celebration to verification. Daniel Carter remained near the projection system. He had already finished his maintenance work. The equipment functioned perfectly, yet he stayed because nobody had dismissed him. Not officially. Several executives occasionally glanced in his direction before quickly looking away. It was an uncomfortable kind of attention, the kind people gave someone they had underestimated. Victoria stood beside the main display screen reviewing revised calculations provided by the finance team. Her patience was beginning to wear thin, not because questions were being asked. Questions were healthy. What bothered her was uncertainty. She built her career on preparation. She expected answers. The chief financial officer moved to the front of the room. We have rerun several projections using updated assumptions. The new data appeared on the screen. Silence followed almost immediately. Several board members exchanged looks. Richard Monroe leaned forward. That is a substantial difference. The executive nodded reluctantly. Yes. Another board member adjusted his glasses. How substantial? Richard answered before anyone else could. Large enough to change the risk profile completely. The room became very still. Outside the windows, helicopters crossed the Chicago skyline. Inside, nobody seemed interested in the view anymore. Victoria stared at the revised numbers. The acquisition was still potentially profitable, but no longer safe, no longer obvious, no longer deserving of immediate approval. She turned toward the finance team. Why was this not identified earlier? No one answered immediately. One executive cleared his throat. Another reviewed documents that suddenly seemed fascinating. The silence spoke louder than any explanation. Daniel watched quietly. He felt no satisfaction, no triumph, only concern. Because if he was right about the first discrepancy, there was a good chance another one existed. He glanced toward the screen again. The same supporting file name appeared within a data reference window. There it was. The second problem, smaller than the first, yet connected. Daniel hesitated. Speaking once had already created enough attention. Speaking twice would not be welcomed, at least not by everyone. Richard Monroe suddenly looked toward the back of the room. Mr. Carter. Several heads turned. Daniel straightened slightly. Yes, sir. Richard closed the report in front of him. You mentioned an inconsistency earlier. The room fell silent again. Victoria folded her arms. One executive sighed heavily. Another looked openly irritated. Richard continued. What exactly did you see? Daniel noticed the expressions around the table. Most expected him to stumble. Others expected a vague answer. A few seemed annoyed that the conversation was happening at all. Daniel remained calm. A reporting date mismatch. Richard nodded. Anything else? Daniel hesitated. The room waited. Then he spoke carefully. There appears to be an asset valuation adjustment tied to projected demand rather than confirmed performance. Several executives immediately reacted. One shook his head. Another laughed quietly. The chief financial officer looked frustrated. That adjustment is standard practice. Daniel nodded respectfully. Sometimes. The executive frowned. Sometimes. Daniel glanced toward the screen. Not when it influences both valuation assumptions and growth projections at the same time. Silence. Real silence this time. Richard slowly reopened the report. Victoria's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Not agreement. Not yet. Curiosity. Richard flipped through several pages. Then another. Then another. The room listened to paper turning. Nothing else. Finally, Richard stopped. His eyes settled on a specific section. He read it twice. Then a third time. When he looked up, the confidence that had filled the boardroom all morning seemed very far away. He is correct. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. One executive stared at the table. Another looked toward the windows. The chief financial officer appeared genuinely stunned. Victoria's gaze shifted from Richard to Daniel, then back again. Richard tapped the report gently. The valuation adjustment appears to affect multiple assumptions simultaneously. Another board member leaned forward. How did we miss that? No one answered. Because nobody knew. Daniel lowered his eyes toward the floor. He had no interest in embarrassing anyone. He understood how mistakes happened. Systems became complicated. Deadlines became tight. Confidence became dangerous. Victoria took a slow breath. Then another. The acquisition that seemed certain less than an hour earlier was now surrounded by serious questions. Yet one question mattered more than all the others. She looked directly at Daniel Carter, the maintenance worker, the single father, the man everyone dismissed before he spoke. And for the first time that morning, Victoria Hayes found herself wondering who he really was. Victoria Hayes held Richard Monroe's report in her hands and read the highlighted section again. Then once more. The numbers were not the problem anymore. The numbers were simply evidence. What troubled her was something deeper. An acquisition that had survived months of review was now unraveling because observations came from a man nobody had considered important enough to listen to. Around the boardroom table, confidence continued slipping away. Executives who entered the meeting expecting approval now avoided eye contact. The chief financial officer reviewed spreadsheets with increasing urgency. Legal advisors whispered quietly among themselves. The atmosphere felt entirely different from the polished certainty that existed earlier that morning. Victoria slowly placed the report on the conference table. I want every supporting assumption reviewed immediately. Several executives nodded. One vice president began gathering documents. Another opened additional data files. The room shifted into damage control mode. Yet Victoria's attention remained fixed on Daniel Carter. He stood near the back wall exactly where he had been all morning. Calm. Respectful, silent. He showed no sign of enjoying the situation. No arrogance. No satisfaction. No desire to embarrass anyone. Somehow that bothered Victoria even more. Because people who sought attention usually revealed themselves quickly. Daniel seemed interested only in the facts. Victoria finally addressed him directly. Mr. Carter. Daniel looked up. Yes, ma'am. The room quieted immediately. Everyone sensed something important was about to happen. Victoria walked toward him slowly. How did you notice this? Daniel answered honestly. I saw inconsistencies while checking the presentation system. A few executives exchanged skeptical looks. Victoria noticed. You identified all of that from a brief glance. Daniel hesitated. Not all of it. Victoria folded her arms. Then how? The room waited. Daniel could feel dozens of eyes focused on him. Yet he remained composed. I reviewed the information after work. Several people looked surprised. One board member raised an eyebrow. Victoria continued. You reviewed confidential acquisition data after work. Daniel shook his head immediately. No. Only public information and materials visible during the system diagnostics. Richard Monroe nodded slightly. He seemed to believe him. The chief financial officer looked unconvinced. That still does not explain how a maintenance technician found errors our analysts missed. The words hung in the air. Not openly hostile, but close. Daniel looked toward the conference table, then back at the executive. Sometimes people stop questioning assumptions because they trust the process. Silence followed. Several board members glanced toward one another. The answer was simple. Uncomfortable. True. The chief financial officer frowned. Our analysts are highly qualified. Daniel nodded. I am sure they are. Then what exactly are you suggesting? Daniel remained calm. Nothing. I am only explaining what I noticed. Victoria studied him carefully. There was something unusual about the way he spoke. No defensiveness. No attempt to prove himself superior. He simply answered questions. That calmness contrasted sharply with the tension filling the rest of the room. An executive seated near the center of the table suddenly laughed. Not loudly, just enough to draw attention. This is becoming ridiculous. Several heads turned. The executive shook his head. We are spending valuable time treating a maintenance worker like an outside consultant. A few uncomfortable smiles appeared around the table. The comment reflected what some people were already thinking. Victoria's expression hardened slightly. Yet before she could respond, the executive continued. With respect, he does not belong in this discussion. Daniel lowered his eyes briefly. He had heard versions of that sentence many times before. Different rooms, different people, same assumption. The executive leaned back in his chair. We have experts for a reason. Another executive nodded in agreement. The atmosphere shifted again, not toward facts, toward status, toward titles, toward hierarchy. Victoria felt frustration rising. The meeting was supposed to be about truth. Instead, it was becoming a debate about who had the right to speak. She turned toward Daniel. Do you have anything else to add? Daniel paused. For a moment, he considered simply leaving. His work order was finished. The projector functioned perfectly. Lily would be waiting for him after school later that afternoon. None of this needed to become his problem. Yet he looked toward the screen one more time. Another inconsistency caught his attention. Smaller than the others, but connected. Important. He opened his mouth slightly. Before he could speak, the same executive who questioned his presence sighed dramatically and shook his head. Then, in front of the entire boardroom, he said the words that instantly changed everything. You are not worth our time. The room fell silent. And for the first time all morning, Daniel Carter slowly lifted his eyes and looked directly across the boardroom table. The words settled over the boardroom like a sudden winter frost. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The executive who delivered the remark seemed satisfied with himself. A few people lowered their eyes toward the conference table. Others stared at their reports. Even the air felt different. Daniel Carter stood quietly beside the projection system. For a moment, he said nothing. He did not look angry. He did not look embarrassed. If anything, he looked tired. Tired of assumptions. Tired of being measured by uniforms instead of character. Tired of watching people confuse titles with wisdom. Victoria Hayes studied him carefully. Richard Monroe watched with equal attention. Around the room, dozens of executives waited to see how the maintenance worker would respond. Most expected silence. A few expected resentment. None expected what happened next. Daniel slowly looked toward the executive who had spoken. Then he glanced at the display screen showing the acquisition model. Finally he spoke. His voice remained calm, quiet, respectful. Then why am I the only person who noticed the subsidiary debt exposure? The room froze. Absolute silence. Not a single chair moved. Not a single paper turned. Even the executive who had insulted him seemed confused. Several board members blinked as if they had misheard. Victoria's eyes narrowed immediately. What did you say? Daniel looked toward the screen. The debt exposure. Richard Monroe sat forward. What debt exposure? Daniel walked slowly toward the conference table. Not confidently. Not dramatically. Simply as someone following logic wherever it led. He pointed toward a section of the financial summary. The acquisition target owns 3 subsidiary entities. Several executives nodded. Everyone knew that. Daniel continued. The model consolidates projected revenue growth from all 3 subsidiaries. More nods. Still nothing unusual. Then Daniel pointed toward another page. But the contingent debt obligations appear to be consolidated from only 2. Silence. Richard immediately opened his report. Victoria grabbed a copy from the table. The chief financial officer frowned. That cannot be correct. Daniel nodded politely. I thought the same thing. Richard began flipping pages rapidly. The chief financial officer did the same. Other executives joined in. The room filled with the sound of paper turning. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody smiled. Victoria reviewed the documentation herself. Her expression grew increasingly serious. Show me. Daniel pointed to the page. Then another. Then a supporting reference document displayed electronically. The connection became visible almost instantly once someone knew where to look. Richard Monroe exhaled slowly. Good Lord. Nobody responded. The older director adjusted his glasses and reviewed the figures again. Then a third time. Finally, he looked toward Victoria. The exposure exists. A wave of silence moved across the room. The chief financial officer stared at his screen. Several executives exchanged shocked looks. One legal advisor immediately began typing notes. Another requested additional documentation. Victoria felt her stomach tighten. The omission changed everything. Not just the acquisition, the risk, the valuation, the approval process. Everything. She looked directly at Daniel. How long have you known? Daniel answered honestly. About 20 minutes. Richard raised an eyebrow. 20 minutes? Daniel nodded. I noticed the discrepancy while everyone was discussing the revised assumptions. The room seemed unable to process that answer. A problem worth potentially millions of dollars had been identified by a maintenance worker during a presentation. Not by analysts, not by consultants, not by executives, by Daniel Carter. Victoria glanced around the boardroom. Earlier that morning, people had laughed when he entered. Some barely acknowledged his existence. One executive openly questioned why he was present. Now nobody could stop looking at him. Yet Daniel seemed entirely unaffected by the attention. He was not trying to win. He was not trying to prove anyone wrong. He was simply following the truth. The executive who had insulted him sat unusually still. His confidence had vanished completely. Richard Monroe closed the report and looked toward Daniel. That sentence may have just saved this company an extraordinary amount of money. Daniel shrugged gently. I just noticed something. The simplicity of the response somehow made the room even quieter. Victoria stared at him for several seconds. Then she looked around the boardroom. Every executive, every advisor, every board member, the same people who spent months reviewing the acquisition. Finally, she spoke. Her voice carried through the silence. The approval vote is suspended immediately. Nobody argued. Nobody objected. Because everyone understood the truth. The meeting had changed forever. And so had the way they viewed the quiet single father standing beside the conference table. For several seconds after the vote was suspended, nobody spoke. The silence felt almost physical. Earlier that morning, the boardroom had been filled with confidence. Now it was filled with reflection. Executives stared at reports that suddenly looked unfamiliar. Advisors reviewed documents they believed they already understood. The acquisition that seemed inevitable now sat in uncertainty because one man noticed what everyone else overlooked. Victoria Hayes stood beside the conference table looking out across the room. She had spent her entire career believing that great decisions came from experience, expertise, and preparation. Those things still mattered. But today had revealed something else. Humility mattered too. Richard Monroe finally broke the silence. I recommend a full independent review before any further action is taken. Several board members agreed immediately. Nobody argued. The chief financial officer looked exhausted. Not defeated, just humbled. He understood what everyone understood. The missing debt exposure was real. The reporting inconsistencies were real. The valuation concerns were real. And the warnings came from the one person nobody expected to provide them. Daniel Carter remained near the back of the room. He quietly began organizing the diagnostic equipment he had originally brought for the projector system. The meeting seemed finished from his perspective. The company had identified the problem. His role was over. Yet as he packed away a cable, Victoria spoke. Mr. Carter. Daniel paused. Yes, ma'am. Victoria stepped toward him. The entire room watched. Would you stay a few more minutes? Daniel nodded politely. Of course. Richard leaned back in his chair and studied Daniel carefully. The older director had seen countless executives throughout his career. Brilliant analysts, talented negotiators, experienced leaders. Yet something about Daniel stood out. Not because of what he knew, because of how he carried it. There was no need for recognition. No need for praise. No desire to dominate the room. Just quiet confidence. Richard finally asked the question everyone wanted answered. Where did you learn financial analysis? Several executives immediately looked up. Daniel hesitated. He rarely discussed his past. Not because he was ashamed of it. Because it no longer defined him. Victoria waited patiently. Richard waited. Eventually Daniel spoke. I worked in investment analysis years ago. The room became still again. A vice president blinked. Another executive lowered his tablet. Victoria looked surprised. Investment analysis? Daniel nodded. For about 12 years. Nobody spoke. The information seemed impossible to reconcile with the man standing before them in a maintenance uniform. Richard smiled slightly. That explains a few things. Daniel returned the smile. Some of them. Victoria folded her arms thoughtfully. Why leave? Daniel looked toward the windows. Chicago stretched across the horizon beneath the afternoon sun. For a moment his thoughts drifted far from boardrooms and acquisitions. They drifted toward a small house in the suburbs, toward a teenage daughter waiting for him to pick her up after school, toward the life he chose. My priorities changed. The answer was simple, yet something about it carried weight. Richard nodded slowly. He seemed to understand immediately. Victoria studied Daniel's expression. There was no regret there, no bitterness. Just acceptance, the kind that comes from making peace with difficult decisions. One executive finally asked what many were thinking. Do you ever miss it? Daniel smiled gently. Sometimes. Then he glanced at the family photo visible on his phone screen resting beside the toolbox. Not enough to trade places. The room followed his gaze. A few executives smiled quietly. Others looked away. Something about that answer reached deeper than financial models and acquisition strategies. It reminded them that success was not always measured by titles, or offices, or salaries. Sometimes success looked like being present for the people who mattered most. Victoria noticed the photograph too. She noticed the pride in Daniel's eyes, the calm certainty, the absence of regret. For the first time that day, she stopped seeing a maintenance worker who unexpectedly understood finance. She saw a father, a man who willingly walked away from prestige because someone else needed him more. The boardroom remained quiet, not uncomfortable, respectful. The laughter from earlier felt impossible now, embarrassing even, because every person in that room realized the same thing at the same moment. They had spent hours evaluating the value of a corporation while completely misunderstanding the value of the person standing among them. And as the afternoon sunlight filled the glass-walled boardroom, that realization settled over everyone like a truth too important to ignore. The boardroom meeting officially ended 2 hours later, but nobody rushed toward the elevators. Small groups remained scattered around the conference table reviewing reports and discussing what had happened. The independent review team had already begun examining the acquisition from the beginning. Early findings confirmed the concerns Daniel Carter identified. The reporting inconsistencies were real. The debt exposure was real. And the financial risks were significantly larger than anyone originally believed. What started as a routine approval meeting had transformed into one of the most important interventions in company history. Daniel had long since finished packing his equipment. Yet he remained because Richard Monroe and several board members continued asking questions. Not about the acquisition anymore. About him. 12 years in investment analysis, one director said while shaking his head. And you never mentioned it? Daniel smiled politely. Nobody asked. A few people laughed quietly. This time the laughter felt different. Not dismissive. Respectful. Richard nodded. That may be the most accurate answer I have heard all day. Victoria Hayes stood near the windows overlooking the city. She watched the conversations unfolding around the room. Earlier that morning, Daniel had occupied the lowest position in everyone's assumptions. Now executives who rarely listened to anyone were listening carefully to him. Yet Daniel seemed unchanged. The attention did not excite him. The praise did not impress him. If anything, he looked eager to leave. Eventually Victoria approached him directly. Do you have a few minutes? Daniel nodded. Of course. They stepped into a smaller executive conference room connected to the main boardroom. The space felt quieter, more personal. Sunlight reflected across the polished table. For several moments, neither spoke. Victoria studied the man sitting across from her. The maintenance uniform still looked exactly the same. Yet now she saw details she missed before. The confidence, the discipline, the calm, the habits of someone who once carried significant responsibility. I owe you an apology, she said finally. Daniel looked surprised. You do? Victoria nodded. I made assumptions about you. Daniel smiled gently. Most people do. The answer somehow made the apology feel heavier. Victoria looked down briefly before continuing. That does not make it acceptable. Daniel remained quiet. She appreciated that. He was not making the moment easier for her, nor harder. He was simply allowing honesty to exist. Victoria leaned back in her chair. You helped prevent a potentially disastrous decision today. Daniel shrugged softly. I noticed some things. You did more than that. For the first time all afternoon, emotion entered her voice. You spoke up when it would have been easier not to. Daniel thought about that. Then he nodded. Maybe. Victoria studied him carefully. Why did you? The answer came immediately. Because someone needed to. Silence followed. Simple words. Powerful truth. Victoria looked toward the city skyline beyond the glass. Throughout her career, she had encountered ambitious people, competitive people, brilliant people. Yet Daniel seemed motivated by something entirely different. Responsibility. Not ego. Not recognition. Responsibility. Later that evening, the independent review team delivered its preliminary findings. The acquisition contained enough unresolved financial exposure to justify immediate suspension. The board unanimously agreed. Had the deal moved forward that morning, the company could have faced consequences costing hundreds of millions of dollars over time. News of the decision remained confidential, but inside the organization, word spread quickly. Employees talked about the meeting. Executives talked about the meeting. Directors talked about the meeting. One detail appeared in every version of the story. The warning came from a single father working in maintenance. The irony fascinated everyone. Yet Daniel himself seemed entirely uninterested in becoming a legend. By 6 o'clock that evening, he was already driving through suburban traffic toward Lily's school. As always, she waited near the front entrance carrying her backpack. The moment she saw his truck, she smiled. Daniel smiled back. The long day instantly felt lighter. Lily climbed into the passenger seat. "How was work?" she asked. Daniel laughed quietly. "Complicated. That usually means something interesting happened." Daniel pulled away from the curb. The evening sun painted the streets gold. Families headed home. Restaurants filled with customers. Life continued normally. "You could say that." Lily grinned. "Tell me everything." Daniel looked at his daughter and smiled. Around boardroom tables, people spent all day debating value. Yet as he drove home beside the person who mattered most, he knew something many powerful executives were only beginning to understand. The most important things in life were rarely listed on financial statements. 3 weeks later, the final independent review was complete. Every concern Daniel Carter identified had been confirmed. The acquisition was officially canceled. Internal reports estimated that moving forward with the deal could have exposed Hayes Global Industries to losses measured in hundreds of millions of dollars over the coming years. The decision never became public knowledge. Most people outside the company would never know how close the organization came to making a costly mistake. But inside the company, everyone knew. The story traveled quietly through executive offices, conference rooms, and hallways. It changed something deeper than a financial outcome. It changed how people looked at one another. One Friday morning, Victoria Hayes called a special meeting of senior leadership and the board. This time the atmosphere felt different from the moment people entered the room. There was less certainty, less ego, more attention, more humility. Daniel arrived only because Victoria personally invited him. He wore the same maintenance uniform, the same work boots, the same company badge clipped to his pocket. Yet nobody laughed when he entered. Nobody whispered. Nobody smirked. The room stood a little straighter. Several executives greeted him by name. Richard Monroe even pulled out the chair beside him. When the meeting began, Victoria stepped to the front of the boardroom. Sunlight poured through the windows behind her. The city skyline stretched across the horizon. For a moment, she simply looked around the room. Then she spoke. "Today is not about a canceled acquisition." The room became silent. "It is about accountability." Nobody moved. Victoria continued. "A few weeks ago, many of us made assumptions about someone without knowing his story." Her eyes moved toward Daniel. Several executives lowered their gaze. They knew exactly what she meant. "We nearly ignored the most important voice in the room because it came from a place we did not expect." Silence deepened. It was not uncomfortable. It was honest. Victoria then did something nobody anticipated. In front of the entire board and leadership team, she turned toward Daniel Carter. "I owe you an apology." Daniel looked surprised. The room listened. "Not because you were right," Victoria said. "Because respect should never depend on titles." No one spoke. The words settled over the boardroom like a lesson everyone needed to hear. Daniel smiled gently. Apology accepted. That was all. No speech. No lecture. No attempt to make the moment larger than it needed to be. Just grace. Richard Monroe smiled quietly. Several board members nodded. The executive who had told Daniel he was not worth their time approached him after the meeting ended. He looked uncomfortable. Honest. Human. "I was wrong," he said. Daniel extended his hand immediately. "We all get things wrong sometimes." The executive shook it. In that moment, there were no winners and losers. Only people learning. Later that afternoon, Victoria offered Daniel a senior advisory position. The salary was impressive. The benefits were extraordinary. The opportunity would have impressed almost anyone. Daniel listened respectfully. Then he smiled. "Thank you." Victoria waited. Daniel glanced at a photo of Lily on his phone. "But I am exactly where I need to be." Victoria laughed softly. For the first time, she fully understood. Success was not something Daniel was chasing anymore. He had already found it. That evening, Daniel picked Lily up from school. They stopped for burgers on the way home. The sun slowly disappeared beyond the horizon as they sat together in a small neighborhood restaurant. Lily talked about classes. friends, future plans. Daniel listened and smiled. The boardroom felt very far away. The skyscraper felt very far away. The arguments, titles, and presentations felt very far away. What remained was simple: a father, a daughter, a life built on love instead of status. As darkness settled outside, Daniel realized something important. The greatest victory was never proving people wrong. The greatest victory was becoming the kind of person who no longer needed to. And somewhere high above the city, executives returned to their offices carrying an unforgettable lesson. Never underestimate quiet dignity. Never mistake humility for weakness. And never assume you know the value of someone simply because you know their job title. Because sometimes the wisest person in the room is the one nobody bothered to notice. And if this story reminded you of the power of respect, perseverance, and second chances, share your thoughts below and join us again for more stories about ordinary people whose quiet courage changes everything.